It is day 6 of the Delphi murders trial. Today, we heard testimony from the officers who interviewed Richard Allen long before his arrest. Thanks for inviting us in. This is our Delphi debrief here on WTHR+. We want to get right out to Delphi, where senior investigative reporter Bob Siegel and Emily Longnecker spent today in court along with our 13 News legal analyst, Katie Jackson-Lindsay. Guys, let's start by breaking down today's testimony.
Hi, Scott. Well, through the first 5 days of testimony that have taken place here in the Delphi murders trial, not a single word or mention of Richard Allen. Today, that changed. At 9:31 this morning, from the very first witness who took the stand and gave her testimony, it has really been all about Richard Allen today.
Yeah, up until today, we've heard about the crime scene, we've heard about the autopsies of Abby and Libby. Today, though, Richard Allen took center stage.
And what the state now is trying to do is to really put together all these pieces that they've been laying out for the jury to try to convince jurors that Richard Allen is the man who's responsible for killing Abby and Libby. We're going to hear in just a few minutes from our 13 News legal analyst, Katie Jackson-Lindsay, who was in court with us all day today. But first, we want to get you up to speed on who the witnesses were that testified today. So let's get that to you here. First of all, Kathy Shank. She is a volunteer file clerk who helped police during the investigation. Dan Dulin, he's a DNR officer who interviewed Richard Allen just 3 days after the murders. Steve Mullin, he's the former Delphi police chief who's now the chief investigator for the Carroll County Prosecutor's Office. We heard from Carroll County Sheriff Tony Liggett. David Vito, he testified today. He's an Indiana State Police trooper who was at Richard Allen's house when police served a search warrant. And last today was Jerry Holman, Indiana State Police investigator who has really overseen the entire Delphi murders investigation. Now, the focus today was really how the state was able to zero in on Richard Allen. And that all started when police decided to take a closer look at an interview that Richard Allen gave to police just 4 days after the murders. Let's talk about that. Allen gave the statement here at this grocery store parking lot in Delphi. He met with the state DNR, with an officer named Dan Dulin, who told jurors that he was assigned to interview Allen after Allen voluntarily called the Delphi murders tip line to say he had been on the Monon trails, not far from the crime scene, on the afternoon of the murders. Dulin testified about what Allen told him. He said he was on the trails between 1:30 and 3:30 on the day of the murders. Allen told the investigator he saw 3 girls walking on the trails. As he walked, he said he was focused on the stock ticker on his cell phone. And Dulin said when he interviewed Richard Allen, there was nothing that stuck out as unusual. In fact, following that interview, the folder with Richard Allen's information in it, it was marked cleared. Investigators testified they essentially forgot all about Allen. In fact, today, Carroll County Sheriff Tony Liggett told jurors information about Allen being near the crime scene got lost. He said it fell through the cracks under, that is until a file clerk happened to notice the information sitting in a banker's box. And that happened again 5 years after the murders, after the statement given by the defendant. That file clerk, Kathy Shank, she explained to the jury how all that happened, and then former Delphi Police Chief Steve Mullin took the witness stand for the second time in this trial to explain how the discovery jump-started the investigation and really allowed them to focus on Richard Allen. Katie Jackson-Lindsay, you had a chance today to be inside the courtroom to see all this play out with your own eyes. One of the things that struck me is the idea here that going to police, Richard Allen actually contacted police himself. Voluntarily, he called the tip line to let investigators know that he had been not far from the crime scene, on the trails where Abby and Libby were on the day that they were murdered. What does a jury make of that? And does it make sense that someone who is accused of murdering two girls would go to police to say, hey, I was at the scene of the crime?
Well, I would think from a common sense perspective, it wouldn't make sense, right? But it's one of those pieces of evidence that can really go either way, because undoubtedly the state will argue, well, he did that to cover his tracks. His family may have known he was out there. Someone else may have known that, or he may have thought someone could identify him. So he would have put that out there to protect himself. Well, the defense will say what you just said. It just doesn't make sense that a guilty person would insert themselves into an investigation about their own criminal conduct.
And what about this idea that police and investigators essentially forgot about Richard Allen, and this case was cleared? The fact that the investigator who talked to Allen just a few days after the murders took place met with him, talked to him face to face, didn't see or hear anything unusual, and they cleared him originally. Is that something that the defense, you anticipate, will really seize on?
Absolutely, because there are a lot of things that are packed in that, right? It again shines a light on how this investigation was handled, that there wasn't a real streamlined system for dealing with these tips and coordinating these tips. It also really highlights that no one thought anything of Richard Allen. The fact that he was cleared is huge, and I think we're going to keep hearing about that throughout the trial. And then there's the question of, okay, so 5 years ago, he wasn't a big deal to you. Well, what was the change? What was the smoking gun, so to speak, that made him chargeable and so interesting at the point where he did get charged?
And some of that evidence, obviously, as far as some of that evidence came about shortly after they interviewed him. I'm going to bring Emily back in here. Emily, obviously, you were in the courtroom at the time when there was a discussion how once the clerk found this paper in a file box saying Richard Allen was on the trails the day that the girls were murdered, once she called and brought that attention again to the sheriff and to the investigators, they seized on that right away.
Yep.
They interviewed Richard Allen again.
Correct.
And they served a search warrant at his home. And there was some really fascinating information today that came out about that search warrant.
Yeah, we heard from the last witness of the day was Indiana State Police Lieutenant Jerry Holman, and he is the lead on this investigation, oversees it, as you said, and he supervised the search warrant execution on Richard Allen's home in October of 2022. And Holman testified. He told Richard Allen when he went there, look, if police damage anything in your house during the search warrant, you can fill out this form and we'll come repair it. And Holman told the jury that Richard Allen said, it doesn't matter, it's over. Holman then said that he and Richard Allen sat in Holman's car. Holman described Richard Allen as being very quiet, that he got out a few times to smoke a cigarette, and asked Holman at that point if police had detained his wife. And Holman told the jury that he told Richard Allen no and offered to drive him to his wife's work. Holman said that Allen replied again for the second time, it doesn't matter, it's over. Now let's take a listen to some of the things that they took out of Allen's home when they served that search warrant. We learned today that they took more than 25 guns and knives, a blue Carhartt jacket, cell phones and pagers, a Sig Sauer gun from Allen's nightstand. They also opened up a wooden box, a memory box, they said, and in it they said there was a card from Richard Allen's mother, some other kind of mementos, but also in it a bullet that was the same kind of bullet recovered at the scene. They also took from Allen's home a photo album showing different pictures of Allen through the years, but also a picture of the Monon High Bridge from 2005. So we're joined back again by Katie Jackson-Lindsay. Katie, what do you think the effect on the jury, the impact on the jury was of seeing all that evidence, hearing about that evidence, seeing that gun today in court?
I think those were huge gains for the state. That evidence that came out in terms of what was in Richard Allen's house, those were huge gains for the state because the jury was able to now get a better idea of who Richard Allen is. And to see more than 25 guns when we know that this was a really brutal crime that involved a knife, and to see those knives that would be intimidating to the average person, I think those were huge gains for them, as well as the jacket that is very similar to the jacket that we see on Bridge Guys. So I definitely think they made some gains with the jury through that evidence.
And you also saw, I can't remember if you were in there at this point when Jerry Holman was asked to take out the gun, the Sig Sauer gun, out of the evidence box, and he was wearing blue gloves, and he took that out, and he checked to make sure there was nothing inside, and you could hear that clicking of the gun as he checked that, and came right up to the jury and showed them that. That was an emotional moment, actually, for the families today when they saw that gun pulled out. You could see Abby and Libby's families getting emotional. We also saw some emotion from Richard Allen's wife, Kathy, when they were describing just going through her home and searching her master bedroom, her kitchen, the closet, the garage, all kinds of things. We were talking about the cell phones and the pagers, and you made a comment about the phones, the type of phones. There's some flip phones in there.
There are phones that are clearly from the 90s, before I ever had a cell phone. And what's impactful about that is that the state was able to establish that they had phones from a long period of time. They had phones from before these murders, they had phones from after, but they did not have a phone that would have matched that time frame in 2017. So again, just another huge gain for the state that's going to be a challenge, I think, for the defense to get over.
Yeah, and we saw some heated exchanges today in court. If we can bring Bob Siegel back in. Bob, you saw, and we both saw, it was, I think, after the lunch break, we saw a heated exchange on cross-examination of Steve Mullins, right, and Andrew Baldwin.
Yeah, we actually saw multiple heated exchanges that took place today. After the interviews, the re-interviews, after they rediscovered Richard Allen as a possible suspect, we heard how the former police chief, he described how they quickly found surveillance video from a nearby business that they went back and checked from 2017 on the day of the murders, and how they were able to match that up with what Richard Allen's car looks like. That they went to the pharmacy where Richard Allen works, and they took a picture of his car. They compared that to the video and were able to match it up. And Mullin described how during the new interviews that they conducted in 2022 with Richard Allen, how Allen told how he had drove to the crime scene. Well, during cross-examination, the defense team really lashed out at Mullin. In fact, the first question that defense attorney Andrew Baldwin asked during cross-examination wasn't a question at all, it was a statement. Here's what he said. He said, "You are so desperate to place Richard Allen's car traveling west on 300 North, near the crime scene, that just before lunch you lied to this jury." And he then got Mr. Mullin to admit that Allen did not tell him that he traveled to the trails that day on the path that Mullin had just told the jury the way that he had traveled there. And that would really impact, potentially, it would bring into question whether or not the car that the state says that they've been able to match up on the video is the same car that Richard Allen has. And then there was an amazing moment between defense attorney Brad Rosie and Sheriff Liggett. It was when the sheriff said that police would have arrested Allen for the murders even without the bullet cartridge evidence that they found at the crime scene, because according to the sheriff, he says that they've got 4 separate witnesses who placed Richard Allen at the crime scene. And we heard from those witnesses earlier this week. Rosie really seized on that comment, and he said, let's talk about those witnesses. And he mentioned how they all gave wildly different descriptions, including witness Betsy Blair, who testified here earlier this week. Rosie said to the sheriff, he said, Betsy Blair saw a man who was boyish and beautiful with brown poofy hair in his 20s or 30s, and her description does not match the description of Richard Allen. Tony Liggett replied to that and said, hey, but neither do the 3 girls who saw him on the trail, basically pointing out their descriptions don't really match what Richard Allen looks like either. Rosie looked at Liggett, and he then looked at the jury, and he said, exactly right, pointing out that's my very point. That's what I'm trying to get you to understand here. Let's talk about that a little bit. What
Sure.
does that testimony, the fact that really the defense was able to highlight during a witness for the state how wildly inconsistent, the descriptions are, and that the man that several of these witnesses that the state are relying on really doesn't match the man that they're looking at in the courtroom. What's that do?
That is a dream moment for a defense attorney. The issue in this case is identity. Is Richard Allen the killer here? And to get a lead investigator on this case to agree with you that there are inconsistent statements as to his identity from all of your from all of the state's witnesses, and highlight that through your lead investigator, that's huge. I mean, I'm sure that the defense didn't expect it would go that well, and I'm sure they're very excited about the way that that came out, and I would imagine that the state is really disappointed, and I think that heated exchange, that sparring, caused a little bit of a slip on behalf of the state's witness, and it really hurt them in the end.
And talk about that sparring going on in the courtroom, those tense moments. I'm trying to see this trial through the eyes of a juror. What does that sparring and those tense back and forth, specifically between the defense and witnesses that the state's putting on, what goes on in the minds of a juror while that's happening?
Well, it can cut a lot of different ways. As a trial attorney, you are always trained that you don't want to offend the jury. You don't want to be offensive towards the jury just as a lawyer, because that never bodes well for your client and for the state. It just never bodes well for the community that you're representing, because if a juror doesn't like you for personality reasons, it makes them not trust your credibility. And so you don't want to go too far with that. But what we're seeing is that this evidence is coming to life now. We have been through 5 days of what's been pretty uncontentious testimony and really no disputes in the evidence. There's no dispute that the girls were murdered. There's no dispute that it was brutal. But now today, for the first time, we are hearing Richard Allen. And so it's causing emotion in the defense, and they're fighting for their client. So they're being zealous advocates, but there's a fine line so that you're not offending the jury.
And I'm curious, from your perspective, you are an experienced litigator. From your perspective, did the defense team come across as belligerent or as really kind of beating up on these witnesses, or do you think that they struck a more neutral tone?
I honestly think they struck a more neutral tone. I think that they kept it professional to the extent that they could, because you also have to remember that the witnesses were being challenging as well. As state's witnesses, especially law enforcement, they should be neutral, because that presumption of innocence should start with the criminal investigation. So they shouldn't come off as if they have a dog in the fight. They should come off as if they are just trying to present the truth. And so sometimes they initiated that sparring with defense counsel, and I think it came back to bite them. And so while both sides have to find a balance in that, I don't think either side reached a level of being unprofessional today.
And Emily, there were other, won't say controversial moments, tense moments, confrontational moments.
There were. When you were talking about that, did they reach a difficult point? I was thinking about that moment when defense attorney Brad Rosie pointed out to Tony Liggett, look, when you arrested Richard Allen, it was at a time when you were running for sheriff. Tony Liggett wasn't the sheriff at the time when Richard Allen was arrested. I think he was perhaps the second in charge. Tobe Lesenby was the sheriff, the Carroll County
Correct.
Sheriff at the time. And he pointed out, you were running for sheriff, and you would have gotten a significant, wouldn't that come with a significant pay raise, he asked him. And Tony Liggett said, this had nothing to do with me. It was about two little girls that were murdered. So that was a tense moment. I also thought when Brad Rosie pointed out to Tony Liggett, look, after the bodies were found, he said to Tony Liggett, Richard Allen stayed right here. He stayed here and he worked right down the street at the CVS. And to that, Tony Liggett replied, yes, hiding in plain sight. And Brad Rosie pointing out, those aren't your words.
We've heard that before.
We've heard that before. That is something that Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter said many times when they were looking, for a suspect. We believe that whoever did this is hiding in plain sight. So.
Yeah. I'm noticing you holding some of your notes here,
Yes.
and I just want to point out for our viewers just how much. Would you hold this for me for a second, Katie? How much information the jury is hearing. I mean, these are these are just some of the notebooks that I've had so far. We're only a week into the trial, and I filled up all these notebooks with testimony. There is a lot that this jury has to keep track of. You got to hear just one day of testimony. Help people understand, how does a juror, when you've got such a complex crime scene and a crime that is now we're hearing about inside of a courtroom, and that these jurors are trying to figure out what happened 7.5 years later. How does a juror keep track of all that? And as an attorney and a litigator in the courtroom, how do you help them keep track of all that?
Well, it has to be a challenge. I've never served on a jury, and so I can't speak to their experience, right? But I can say I have a notebook full from just one day today as an attorney who's observing. And so as a lawyer, part of your strategy has to be to make sure that you are hitting your big points in a way that the jury is really paying attention. So even in crafting your questions, those lawyers are at home tonight brushing up on their outlines for tomorrow and making sure that they're delivering that information in a way that it's memorable and in a way that they're not wasting time with things that don't really matter.
And we should point out, the jurors are taking really careful notes as well. They all have notebooks and they all have folders, and they're getting tons and tons of pieces of the evidence and the exhibits that have been submitted in this case. And they get to collect all that along with their notebooks. They're not allowed to leave the courtroom with it, so they don't take it back to the hotel with them, but they have all that information that they can refer to later on as they are going into their deliberations. I want to mention something else that happened in court today. It was a piece of video that we got to see. And this is video that we've heard about, and actually video that most of us have all seen before. It's the Down the Hill video and Bridge Guy video is what we've heard it referred to as. Video that Libby German took on her cell phone on the day of the murders. Presumably, it appears, just moments before the murders took place. State police were able to recover her cell phone. It was actually under Abby Williams' body at the crime scene. They recovered it, they downloaded the video, and this is the video that was put out to the public to ask for help in trying to identify who the murderer was. Today, we got to see really enhanced images from that video, and the jury got to see it too. We're talking about a 43-second video. We got to see that earlier this week. But today we got to see what investigators have been working off of. The sheriff said he has seen this video hundreds of times, and we got to see in that video how they're able to really zoom in to see Bridge Guy as he's walking up behind Abby Williams on the bridge. Right. And they were able to isolate using enhancements and software. They were able to really isolate the audio, get rid of the background noise, to enhance what the words are on there. And so today the jury got to see and hear that inside the courtroom. And I'm going to tell you what they had to, what's said now on there. Again, we could see Bridge Guy much more closely than we have seen before. And Sheriff Tony Liggett, he told the jury what he hears on that video. He hears Abby saying, "Is he right here? Don't leave me up here." And this is when you can see the image of Bridge Guy behind her. And then Libby says, "That be a gun. There's no path here." And then we hear Bridge Guy say, "Guys." One of the girls says, "Hi." Then the man says, "Down the hill." So this is some chilling video again. We've seen it, we've heard it before, but seeing it really enhanced and hearing Abby and Libby's voices, it was a moment, I think, that stood out from the testimony today, and it's something that the jury will certainly be looking at closely and presumably trying to figure out, is the man in that video that they saw in courtroom today, is that Richard Allen?
And the defense seemed to go after the enhancement, saying to Tony Liggett, asking Tony Liggett, or trying to point out, you can't really see Bridge Guy's mouth moving when you hear those words, and asking Tony Liggett, is it possible that there could be somebody else off camera that we don't see saying those words and Tony Liggett saying no, but then that segued into another moment where Brad Rosie asked Tony Liggett, do you believe Richard Allen acted alone in this case? Tony Liggett said yes. He said, have you always believed that was the case? Tony Liggett said yes. And then he asked him this question, did you ever tell your former boss, Carroll County Sheriff Tobe Lesenby, that you thought maybe more than one person did this? And Tony Liggett replied, I may have told him maybe, it's possible. So we had that moment right there.
And what's really interesting about that is we've heard at other hearings and other testimony that for a good portion of this investigation, state police considered that it was possibly 2, 3, 4 individuals. We heard testimony this summer from one of the investigators who said we were thinking perhaps 3 to 5 people committed this crime. Right. And now we're hearing today, I'm assuming the defense is going to bring that up when it's their turn, if they choose to present that portion of the case. But to hear that there's one person with the idea that we've already heard investigators say that many of them believed and they had instructions to be looking for multiple people who might be the perpetrators in this crime. What's that going to do in the minds of the jury?
Well, that's really tricky evidence to navigate for the defense, especially because they have been precluded from presenting evidence of potential other suspects. And so it's really tricky to have this information and have to dance around it so that you don't violate the court's orders and cause a mistrial, but know that it exists, right? And on the other hand, I think that there's also an opportunity for the defense because we now know that the state is putting all of its eggs in one basket, and that is that Richard Allen is a bridge guy. And so the jury has to decide, is Richard Allen bridge guy? And from what we've heard and what we've seen so far, I don't think the jury is there. Because even today, we were getting questions from the jury about what was Richard Allen's hair like. Because there's that testimony that bridge guy had hair.
Brown,
and Richard
poofy
Allen,
hair.
Right.
Poofy hair.
And Richard Allen does not. And so the defense is navigating a lot of landmines and ultimately navigating a lot of inconsistent evidence. And I think ultimately it will come together where they'll say, they'll rely on that instruction. If the evidence lends itself to 2 reasonable interpretations, you have to go with the one consistent with his innocence. And so if it's blurry, it's not guilty, right? And so it may work out to their advantage. But on the other hand, if the jury believes that bridge guy is Richard Allen, it's game over and the state has met their burden.
Emily and I, we see this through the eyes of journalists when we're in there. You have years and years of litigation experience as an attorney. You've seen it both as a defense attorney, you've been on the other side as a prosecutor. I'm just curious, what are your thoughts and what things really stood out to you today, Katie?
Well, it was very interesting to have the opportunity to actually be in the courtroom today and to be able to give analysis having witnessed it firsthand. When you're in the courtroom, it's an entirely different environment. We're just feet away from Abby and Libby's families. We're just feet away from Richard Allen. I was immediately struck by his stature when he came into the courtroom because we've heard all of these awful things, and it's hard to imagine that a man of his size actually committed this crime, considering...
The reaction on your face when he walked into the courtroom and you saw him for the first time, I saw the look on your face and it was one of almost disbelief.
Right, and I would have to imagine that was the initial reaction of the jury, right? And so to some extent, I'm sitting from the vantage point of a juror because this is not my case. I don't know all the ins and outs. And this evidence I'm hearing today, I'm hearing this for the first time. But what I mainly honed in on as a lawyer today was the strategy of the lawyers to try to get an idea of how they were building their cases. And so some things that stuck out to me, a really big thing, was that we didn't hear Richard Allen's statement. We heard them presented through witnesses, which is what we call cherry picking in trial work. Instead of just playing the video, letting the jury hear it, letting them see his demeanor, letting them hear his voice, because they have the audio of Bridge Guy, right? And so wouldn't you want the jury to hear Richard Allen's voice? And the defense made a big deal out of that. They kept calling it the video recording. And so that was interesting strategy on both sides. Another really interesting piece of strategy was during the state's case, when they would ask questions on direct exam, you would think, man, that was a zinger. They really laid a good groundwork for some solid evidence there. But then on cross-examination, you would realize that they sort of mischaracterized the evidence. So for example,
Yeah, let's
Dulin,
give an example.
Yeah, Dulin, the DNR officer, he made a really big deal out of Richard Allen changing his profile and his fishing license, changing his height, changing his weight shortly after the murders.
Yes.
And then we learned on cross-exam that that's not really what happened. He changed it back to something that had been there before. So it wasn't as if he was trying to change his identity. He was simply updating the profile in a way that reflected what had been there before. And then the last thing that I thought was a big deal was the objections that we heard. So you have to object to some things to make a record, and you just have to make those objections in case this case goes up on appeal in the event of a conviction. But there are sometimes you have to be strategic about your objections. And so we heard a lot throughout the day beyond the scope of direct exam. And we heard that from the state. And what that really means is the defense should not be talking about that because we didn't bring it up. And so it starts to give a feel of trying to hide things from the jury, because the reality is they can make that objection, and if the judge sustains it, the defense can't go into it, but the defense can recall those witnesses and do their own direct examination of those witnesses. And so why not let the evidence come out right then and there? So the one time the judge overruled it, we learned that they didn't want the jury to know about those sticks that were collected several days later. And so it was just interesting watching strategy and seeing how that's playing into building their cases.
Katie, what did you make of that moment when the state presented the moment they go to Richard Allen's house, they serve that search warrant, and he says, it doesn't matter, it's over. And then we learn on cross-examination that that search warrant was served a few hours after they had recorded this interview. At this point, Richard Allen knows he is a suspect. He's been told that he is a suspect, and has this idea. Then the police pull up 2 hours later to his house. Did you think that made a difference on the cross? The context of that, anyway.
I do, because that's another one of those zingers. You hear as a juror that Richard Allen said it doesn't matter, it's over, and that feels like a confession. And then you realize he is saying that after he's been picked up, after he's been interviewed for 2 hours before, after they've torn his house apart, serving a search warrant, and he's a member of this community. He knows how big this case is. And so you have the weight of the world on your shoulders in that moment as a suspect. That's a natural response. Whatever you're telling me right now, it doesn't even matter, because it's over for me, because you guys think I did this. And I'm not going to be able to convince you I did it.
And the defense pointed out that during that video interview 2 hours earlier, he maintained his innocence over and over and over again.
Right.
Even though they said, look, you're a suspect, then 2 hours later, there they are at his house. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter, it's over. That's what he says after.
Right. I mean, I think that's a normal human reaction. He knows how heavy this situation is for this community. He knows how many resources have gone into this. And now all of a sudden he realizes they think I did this. And he's protested his innocence for hours and he couldn't convince them. And so I think it's a normal human reaction, but it can certainly be viewed as a confession.
Yeah, I saw everyone kind of sit up in their seat when he said, it doesn't matter, it's over. And there was like this moment of recognition. But then on cross, given that context, you can see how they would see it differently, maybe.
And there was a moment today when it was during a cross-examination when Andrew Baldwin again pointed out, defense attorney Andrew Baldwin pointed out, he said words matter. And he said words matter here in the courtroom and in a high-stakes situation like this. Every word really does matter. Katie Jackson-Lindsay, what a pleasure having you in the courtroom with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
It was great to be here.
Emily and I will be back inside the courtroom with a front row seat tomorrow. We've been inside the courtroom for every day of this trial. Our plan and our intent is to continue that all the way through a verdict. We're so glad to have you with us tonight. For now, we are going to send it back to you, Scott, as we get prepared for day 7 tomorrow morning here in Delphi.
Fascinating discussion from our team there in Delphi that has been inside the courtroom, giving us really a really perfect summary of what happened during this day 6. Thanks so much, team. We're going to be breaking down the Delphi murders trial every weeknight at 10 o'clock here on WTHR+. You can also find our ongoing coverage, including detailed reports on each day of this trial, just by going to WTHR.com/Delphi. Thanks for joining us.